The dusty alley behind Morrison's general store reeked of rotting vegetables and broken dreams, and that was where Jake Henderson first saw the woman who would change everything he thought he knew about honor, love, and justice in the scorching summer of 1877 in Silver Creek, Nevada. Jake had been leading his chestnut mare through the back streets to avoid the afternoon crowd when he heard it, a soft, desperate sound that might have been mistaken for a wounded animal if not for the distinctly human quality of its desperation. He tied his horse to a weathered post and moved cautiously around the corner of the building, his hand instinctively moving toward the Colt revolver at his hip before he realized the source of the noise posed no threat to anyone but his conscience. She was crouched between two wooden crates, her once fine dress now torn and stained with dirt that spoke of many desperate days. Her dark hair hung in tangles around a face that would have been beautiful if not hollowed by hunger, and her trembling hands clutched at a piece of bread so moldy that Jake doubted even the rats would touch it. What struck him most was not her condition, but the way she held herself like someone trying to maintain dignity even as everything else had been stripped away. "Ma'am?" Jake said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up with eyes that were green as creek water in springtime, and in them he saw terror mixed with defiance. She scrambled to her feet, pressing herself against the rough wooden wall of the shop, the moldy bread still clutched protectively to her chest. "I am not doing anything wrong," she said, and her voice carried the educated accent of someone who had known better days. "I was just resting. I will move along now." Jake held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not the law, ma'am, and even if I were, there is no crime in resting. But I am wondering if maybe you might be hungry for something better than that bread you are holding." She looked down at the moldy piece in her hands as if seeing it for the first time, and something in her expression crumbled. "I do not have money to pay for food." "Did not ask you for money," Jake said easily. He reached into the saddlebag on his mare and pulled out the cloth-wrapped bundle his landlady had packed for him that morning. "Got more here than I can eat myself. Roast beef sandwich, some cheese, couple of apples. You would be doing me a favor by taking some off my hands." The woman stared at the offered food like a drowning person stares at a rope, wanting desperately to reach for it but afraid it might be yanked away. Jake understood that kind of hesitation. He had seen it in the eyes of men who had been beaten down too many times to trust kindness anymore. "I promise you, ma'am, there are no strings attached to this offer. A man gets hungry working cattle, and his landlady always packs too much. Would be ashamed to let good food go to waste." She took one tentative step forward, then another, and then her hand reached out and accepted the bundle with fingers that shook so badly she nearly dropped it. The moment the food was in her possession, tears began streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "You cannot know what this means." Jake watched as she unwrapped the cloth with reverent care and took a bite of the sandwich. The way she ate told him everything he needed to know about how long it had been since her last proper meal. She was trying to eat slowly, with manners, but her body betrayed her with its desperate need. "When did you last eat something substantial?" he asked gently. She swallowed hard and wiped at her eyes with the back of one hand. 3 days ago, I managed to get some potato peelings from the hotel kitchen. Before that, I cannot quite remember." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. 3 days? "Ma'am, with all due respect, what in blazes are you doing starving in an alley? This town has churches, charitable societies, people who would help a woman in distress." Something dark and bitter crossed her face. "Those charitable people answer to the men with money in this town, and the man with the most money does not want me helped. He wants me desperate. He wants me broken. He wants me to come crawling back and beg him to take me back on any terms he chooses." Jake felt his jaw tighten. He had been working as a ranch hand and occasional deputy in Silver Creek for 2 years now, and he knew exactly which man she was talking about before she even said the name. "Charles Pemberton," she said, confirming his suspicion. "My husband, the respected banker, the pillar of the community, The man who holds the mortgages on half the businesses in town and the secrets of the other half. Jake had met Charles Pemberton exactly 3 times, and 3 times had been more than enough. The banker was a man who wore expensive suits and cold smiles, who spoke in polite words that somehow made you feel dirty, who looked at people the way other men looked at livestock they were considering purchasing. "You are Mrs. Pemberton," Jake said slowly, pieces clicking into place. "I heard the banker's wife had left him a few months back. Folks said she had gone east to stay with family." That is the story Charles told, and who would question him? A man of his standing would hardly admit that his wife ran from him in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on her back. She took another bite of the sandwich, chewing carefully. "I did try to leave Silver Creek entirely. I made it as far as the stage station before I discovered that Charles had already been there, warning them that his poor, mentally unstable wife might try to leave town, and that they should hold her and contact him immediately if she appeared." "That is kidnapping," Jake said, anger rising in his chest. "That is against the law." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The law is whatever Charles Pemberton says it is in this town. The sheriff owes him money. The judge owes him favors. The stage line owner owes him his business license. I tried to hire a horse from the livery, but Charles had already been there too. I tried to appeal to the pastor's wife for help, but she told me that a woman's place is with her husband and that I should pray for a more submissive spirit." Jake thought about the power dynamics of Silver Creek and felt sick. "So you have been trapped here, with no money, no way to leave, and no one willing to help." "Charles had our house watched for the first month. I stayed with a Mexican family on the edge of town, people too poor for Charles to have leverage over, but I could not stay forever. I was putting them at risk, and they had little enough to share as it was. For the past 6 weeks, I have been sleeping wherever I can find shelter and eating whatever I can find." She finished the sandwich and looked at the apple in her hand with an expression of such profound gratitude that Jake felt his throat tighten. "Why has he not just dragged you back to the house by force?" "Because Charles does not want a wife. He wants a possession that chooses to be possessed. He wants me to come back of my own accord, defeated, willing to accept whatever conditions he sets. He has always been like that. He enjoys breaking things slowly, watching them struggle, knowing that eventually they will have no choice but to surrender." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I would rather die in this alley than give him that satisfaction." Jake made a decision in that moment that he knew would complicate his life in ways he could not yet predict. But some things were more important than a simple life. "What is your given name?" "Ma'am?" She looked up at him in surprise. "Catherine. Catherine Pemberton, though I would gladly shed that last name if I could." "Well, Miss Catherine, my name is Jake Henderson, and I think we need to have a longer conversation about your situation, but not here in this alley. Are you willing to come with me somewhere we can talk properly?" Suspicion flickered in her eyes. "To where?" "There is a boarding house on the east side of town run by a widow named Mrs. Clara Donovan. She is a tough old bird who does not take kindly to bullies, and she happens to owe me a favor after I helped her son out of some trouble last year. I think she might be willing to give you a room and some work to pay for it, at least until we can figure out a more permanent solution. Mrs. Donovan will have heard the stories about me. Charles will have made sure of that. Then I guess we will find out if Mrs. Donovan is the kind of woman who believes gossip or the kind who believes her own eyes," Jake said. He extended his hand. "What do you say, Miss Catherine? You willing to take a chance on a cowboy and a widow against a banker?" Catherine looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and Jake could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Trust had clearly been beaten out of her over the past months, maybe over the past years. But finally she reached out and placed her hand in his, and despite the dirt and the calluses and the trembling, her grip was firm. "I do not know why you are helping me, Mr. Henderson, but I am grateful beyond words. Just Jake, please. And as for why, well, my mother raised me to believe that when you see someone in trouble, you help them. Simple as that." It was a 20-minute walk to Mrs. Donovan's boarding house, and Jake made sure to take the back streets to avoid the prying eyes of the town gossips. Catherine walked beside him in silence, eating the apple slowly to make it last, and Jake found himself stealing glances at her profile. Even worn down by hunger and hardship, there was something compelling about her, a strength that had not quite been broken despite everything Charles Pemberton had done to break it. Mrs. Donovan answered the door herself, a broad-shouldered Irish woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that could cut through nonsense like a hot knife through butter. She took one look at Catherine and then turned her piercing gaze on Jake. "What have you brought to my doorstep, Jake Henderson?" "A woman who needs help, Mrs. Donovan. A place to stay, some honest work if she is willing, and people around her who will not ask questions she does not want to answer." Mrs. Donovan crossed her arms. "I know who she is. The whole town knows who she is." "Then you know she is Charles Pemberton's wife, and you know what kind of man Charles Pemberton is," Jake said steadily. "Question is, are you going to believe the stories a man like that tells, or are you going to trust your own judgment?" The widow studied Catherine for a long moment, taking in the torn dress, the hollow cheeks, the desperate pride in her eyes. "Can you cook, girl?" "Yes, ma'am," Catherine said, "and I can clean, mend clothes, tend a garden, and keep accounts." "Keep accounts, can you? That is useful. My eyes are not what they used to be, and I have been making a mess of my ledgers." Mrs. Donovan stepped aside and held the door open. "Come inside, then. You look like you could use a hot bath and a proper meal. We will talk about the details after you have had both." The relief on Catherine's face was so profound that Jake felt his chest tighten. "Thank you, Mrs. Donovan. I promise you will not regret this." "Probably will regret it," the widow said dryly. "Usually do when I let my soft heart overrule my practical sense. But life is too short to turn away from people who need help just because it might be inconvenient." She pointed a finger at Jake. "You boy, come back tomorrow evening. I expect this situation is going to need more figuring out than a room and a hot meal." Jake tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am, I will be here." He turned to leave, but Catherine's voice stopped him. "Jake, thank you for seeing me, for not looking away." When he met her eyes, something passed between them that Jake could not quite name, something that felt like the beginning of something much larger than either of them had planned for. "Get some rest, Miss Catherine. Things will look better after a good meal and a soft bed." As Jake walked back toward the boarding house where he rented a small room, his mind was churning with the problem Catherine presented. Charles Pemberton was not the kind of man who would simply let his wife go, especially not when it was clear she had found help. The banker would see it as a challenge to his authority, a threat to his control. And men like Charles Pemberton did not respond well to having their control threatened. Jake spent a restless night turning the situation over in his mind, considering and discarding various plans. By the time dawn broke over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, he had the beginnings of an idea. It was risky, maybe even dangerous, but it was the only path he could see that might actually work. He spent the day working with the horses at the ranch where he was employed, but his mind was elsewhere. His boss, a grizzled rancher named Tom Morrison, who had run cattle in Nevada since before the war, noticed his distraction. "You got woman troubles, Henderson?" Tom asked, leaning against the fence while Jake worked a young stallion on a lead line. "Something like that," Jake admitted. "The kind of woman troubles that might interfere with your work?" "No, sir, the kind that might require me to take a few personal days soon to sort some things out." Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You are a good hand, Jake, and I trust your judgment. You need time. You take it. Just give me fair warning so I can shuffle the work around." "Appreciate that, sir." That evening, Jake returned to Mrs. Donovan's boarding house, as promised. The widow met him at the door and led him to the small parlor where Catherine was sitting in a chair by the window, mending a shirt. The transformation was remarkable. With clean hair, a simple but well-fitted dress that Mrs. Donovan must have provided, and some color returning to her cheeks after a day of regular meals, Catherine looked like a completely different person. More than that, she looked alive in a way she had not in the alley. "Jake," she said, standing when he entered, "Mrs. Donovan has been incredibly kind. I have been helping with the cooking and the mending, and she has agreed to let me stay in exchange for work. That is wonderful news, Jake said, though he knew the real problem was just beginning. But we need to talk about what happens when your husband finds out where you are, because he will find out. In a town this size, secrets do not keep for long. Miss Donovan settled into her own chair with a decisive thump. Already thought of that. Charles Pemberton has no legal right to enter my property, and I am quite prepared to defend my home and my guests with force if necessary. She patted the shotgun that rested beside her chair, but the boy is right. We need a longer-term plan. Catherine's face had gone pale. Maybe I should leave. I do not want to bring trouble down on either of you. Too late for that, Mrs. Donovan said matter-of-factly. Besides, I have never liked Charles Pemberton. Man tried to foreclose on my property 5 years back when I fell behind on some payments after my husband died. Would have succeeded, too, if my son had not found evidence that Pemberton had been charging illegal interest rates. We came to an understanding after that, but I have been waiting for a chance to return the favor. Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Miss Catherine, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did your husband ever strike you? She looked down at her hands. Yes, not often, and never where it would show. Charles is too clever for that. He knows how to hurt someone without leaving marks, or at least without leaving marks that anyone would see in polite company. Rage flared hot in Jake's chest, but he kept his voice level. Did he threaten you? Constantly. He would tell me about what happened to other people who crossed him. Always careful to phrase it as concern or gossip, but the message was clear. He told me that if I ever left him, he would make sure I had nothing and no one. He told me I was worthless without him, that no one would believe me over him, that I was lucky he was willing to keep me despite my flaws. Her voice cracked slightly. After a while, I started to believe him. What made you run? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still working the needle through the fabric of the shirt. He brought home papers one night, legal documents that would have signed over the small inheritance I received from my father to Charles's control. My father died 3 years ago and left me a modest sum held in trust in San Francisco. It was the only thing I had that was truly mine, and Charles wanted it. When I refused to sign, he told me he would make me sign one way or another. That night, after he had drunk himself into a stupor, I ran. Do you still have access to that inheritance? Jake asked, an idea forming. In theory, yes. The bank in San Francisco sends correspondence to a postal box that only I have the key to, but I have not been able to collect my mail in months because the post office is next to Charles's bank, and he has people watching for me. How much money are we talking about? Nearly $3,000. My father was a merchant, and he was very careful with his money. He set up the trust specifically so that my husband could not touch it without my consent. She looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. If I could access that money, I could leave Nevada entirely. I could start over somewhere Charles could never find me. Mrs. Donovan made a thoughtful noise. $3,000 would buy a lot of distance and a fresh start, but getting it would mean going to San Francisco. Or getting the bank in San Francisco to transfer the funds to another location, Jake said slowly. What if we could arrange for the money to be sent to a bank in another territory, somewhere far enough from Silver Creek that Charles Pemberton's influence does not reach? The trust requires my signature in person to authorize any transfers, Catherine said. My father was worried about fraud, so he set up strict requirements. I would have to go to San Francisco myself. Jake thought about the logistics. San Francisco was nearly 200 miles away, a journey of several days by stage or on horseback. Your husband would have the stage lines watched same as he does here? Then we do not take the stage, Mrs. Donovan said. Jake, you are a fair hand with horses. What if you and Catherine rode to San Francisco, stay off the main roads, travel quick and quiet, get there before Charles even realizes she is gone? It was a bold plan, maybe even reckless. But Jake could not see another option that did not involve Catherine spending the rest of her life trapped in Silver Creek. It could work, but Miss Catherine, you would be traveling alone with me, an unmarried man, for several days. I give you my word that I would behave with complete honor, but people would talk. Catherine looked at him with those green eyes, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw something other than fear or exhaustion in them. He saw determination. Let them talk. My reputation is already in ruins, according to most people in this town. What matters is getting free. Then we ride at dawn day after tomorrow, Jake said. That gives me time to arrange for horses and supplies without drawing too much attention. Mrs. Donovan, can you keep Miss Catherine safe here until then? Anyone who wants to get to this girl will have to go through me and my shotgun first, the widow said grimly. The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jake went about his normal routine at the ranch, but spent his lunch break making quiet preparations. He bought supplies from different merchants to avoid suspicion, telling each that he was planning a hunting trip in the mountains. He arranged with Tom Morrison for a week of personal time citing family business. He selected 2 of the strongest horses from the ranch's string, a gray gelding for himself and a gentle bay mare for Catherine, and paid Tom for their use out of his own pocket. That evening he returned to Mrs. Donovan's boarding house to find Catherine waiting with a small bag of belongings. She looked nervous but resolute, and when she met his eyes, Jake felt that strange flutter in his chest again. "Are you certain you want to do this?" he asked. "Once we leave, there's no turning back. If your husband catches us, it will go badly for both of us." "I am certain," Catherine said firmly. "I would rather die trying to escape than spend another day living in fear." They spent the evening going over the route Jake had planned, a winding path that would take them through the hills and valleys east of Silver Creek before turning west toward California. It would add time to the journey, but it would keep them off the main roads where Charles Pemberton might have people watching. Mrs. Donovan fed them a hearty dinner and then fixed Catherine with a stern look. "You are a brave woman, Catherine Pemberton. Do not let anyone tell you different. But bravery without caution gets people killed. You listen to Jake, you keep your head down, and you get yourself to San Francisco and claim what is rightfully yours." "I will," Catherine promised. "And Mrs. Donovan, when I'm settled somewhere safe, I will send you money to repay you for your kindness." "Do not want your money, girl. Just want to know you are safe and happy. That will be payment enough." Jake left shortly after, making his way back to his own room to get what little sleep he could before the long ride ahead. He lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was making a terrible mistake. He barely knew Catherine Pemberton, and yet here he was, risking his job, his reputation, and possibly his life to help her escape her husband. It was foolish and impulsive and completely unlike his usual careful nature. But when he closed his eyes, he saw her as she had been in that alley, hungry and desperate, but still fighting, still refusing to give up. He saw the strength in her eyes and the grace with which she carried herself despite everything she had endured, and he knew with a certainty that defied logic that helping her was the right thing to do. Dawn broke clear and cold, the early autumn air carrying a bite that promised winter would come early to the Nevada high desert. Jake collected the horses and rode quietly through the still dark streets to Mrs. Donovan's boarding house. Catherine was waiting on the porch, dressed in a split riding skirt and jacket that the widow must have altered for her. Her dark hair was braided tightly and pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat. "Ready?" Jake asked softly. "Ready," Catherine confirmed. They rode out of Silver Creek as the first light touched the mountains, 2 small figures on horseback disappearing into the vast landscape. Jake set a steady pace, not too fast to tire the horses, but quick enough to put distance between them and the town. He kept to game trails and dry creek beds, avoiding anywhere they might encounter other travelers. For the first few hours they rode in silence. Catherine handled her horse competently, and Jake noted with approval that she sat well in the saddle and moved with the mare's rhythm. Finally, as the sun climbed higher and they stopped to water the horses at a small spring, she spoke. "You must think I'm foolish for marrying Charles in the first place." Jake considered his words carefully. "I think people show us their best faces when they're courting. I expect Charles Pemberton can be quite charming when he wants to be." "He was," Catherine said quietly. "He was attentive and generous and made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. My father had just died, and I was grieving and alone, and Charles seemed like safety, like security. She laughed bitterly. I did not realize until after the wedding that what he offered was not security but a cage. When did things change? Almost immediately. The night of our wedding, he told me the rules of our marriage. I was to dress how he wanted, speak when spoken to, entertain his guests with charm but never have opinions, never question his decisions, never do anything that might embarrass him. When I protested, he told me I had already signed my name in the church registry, and there was no going back now. They continued riding, and as the day wore on, Catherine told him more of her story. She had been 19 when she married Charles, who was 15 years her senior. Her father had been a merchant in Sacramento, and she had received a good education, unusual for a woman of that time. She had dreamed of perhaps teaching school, but society's expectations and her father's declining health had pushed her toward marriage instead. I thought Charles respected my education, she said as they navigated a rocky hillside. He would ask me to read to him, to discuss books and current events. I thought we were partners. But after the wedding, any time I expressed an opinion that differed from his, he would mock me for thinking a woman's education made her qualified to have thoughts. Jake felt his anger at Charles Pemberton growing with every word. How long were you married before he first struck you? 6 months. I had disagreed with him about something, I cannot even remember what now, and he slapped me across the face. Afterward, he apologized and said I had driven him to it with my stubbornness. He bought me an expensive necklace and promised it would never happen again. She paused. It happened again 2 weeks later, and then again, and eventually I stopped counting. They rode until the sun was setting, then made camp in a sheltered hollow between 2 hills. Jake built a small fire and made coffee while Catherine unpacked the food Mrs. Donovan had sent with them. They ate in companionable silence, both too tired for much conversation. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Catherine spoke again. Why are you doing this, Jake? You could lose everything if Charles discovers you helped me. Jake poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks spiral up into the night. I grew up with a father who believed that a real man protects those who cannot protect themselves. He was a lawman in Texas before he was killed breaking up a bar fight when I was 12. My mother raised me and my sisters on her own after that, working as a seamstress, taking in laundry, doing whatever it took to keep us fed. I saw how hard life can be for a woman alone, especially when men with power decide to make things difficult. You have sisters? 2. Both married now, with families of their own back in Texas. Good men who treat them right. He looked up and met Catherine's eyes across the fire. I suppose I do this because I would hope someone would do the same for them if they ever needed help. Something in Catherine's expression softened. Your mother raised a good man, Jake Henderson. She tried her best, Jake said, feeling uncomfortable with the praise. We should get some sleep. Want to be moving again at first light. He spread out his bedroll on one side of the fire and Catherine's on the other, a careful distance apart. As he lay looking up at the stars, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft sounds of Catherine settling in for the night, Jake realized that something had shifted in him over the past 2 days. This was no longer just about helping a woman in trouble. Somewhere along the way, Catherine Pemberton had become someone he cared about deeply, someone he wanted to protect not out of duty, but out of something much more personal. The thought should have terrified him, but instead it felt right in a way few things in his life ever had. They rose before dawn and were back in the saddle as the first gray light touched the horizon. The second day of riding passed much like the first long hours of steady travel, broken by brief stops to rest and water the horses. But the silence between them was different now, more comfortable, and when they did talk, the conversation flowed easily. Catherine asked about his life, and Jake found himself telling her things he rarely shared with anyone. He told her about growing up in a small Texas town, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about the ache of watching his father's coffin being lowered into the ground. He told her about drifting west after his mother remarried, working on ranches across Texas and New Mexico before landing in Nevada. Do you ever think about settling down properly? Catherine asked as they followed a game trail through a stand of juniper trees. Buying land, Starting a family? Used to think about it more, Jake admitted. But it is hard to build something permanent when you're working someone else's ranch for wages that barely cover room and board. It takes capital to start a place of your own, and I have been sending most of my earnings back to my mother and sisters. That is admirable, Jake shrugged. It is what family does. On the third day, they spotted riders in the distance behind them. Jake's stomach clenched as he urged Catherine to increase their pace, pushing the horses harder than he wanted to. They reached a rocky outcropping and took cover, watching as the riders drew closer. "Is it Charles?" Catherine whispered, her face pale. Jake studied the approaching men through narrowed eyes. There were 3 of them, and as they got closer, he recognized one as a deputy from Silver Creek, a man named Frank Sutton, who supplemented his law enforcement wages by doing odd jobs for anyone with money, which meant Charles Pemberton had indeed sent men after them. "It is men from town," Jake said quietly. "We need to move, now." They led their horses deeper into the rocks, moving as quietly as possible, and then circled around to head in a different direction. Jake's heart pounded as he listened for sounds of pursuit, but the riders seemed to have lost their trail in the rocky ground. They rode hard for the rest of the day, and by nightfall, both they and the horses were exhausted. Jake found a sheltered spot under an overhang of rock where they could camp without being easily seen, and he decided against a fire despite the cold night air. They huddled together for warmth, sharing a blanket, and Jake was acutely aware of Catherine's closeness, the way she trembled with cold and fear. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him gratefully. "Do you think they will find us?" she asked quietly. "Not if I can help it," Jake said, with more confidence than he felt. "Tomorrow we should reach the California border. Once we are in another state, it gets harder for them to operate with legal backing." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Jake, if they catch us, do not let them take me back. I would rather die out here than return to that house." "They are not going to catch us," Jake said firmly, "and you are not going to die. You are going to get to San Francisco, claim your inheritance, and start the life you deserve." She turned her face up toward his, and even in the darkness he could see the shine of her eyes. "What kind of life do I deserve, do you think?" "A life where you are safe, where you are respected, where you can make your own choices and be your own person." He hesitated, then added softly, "A life where you are loved the way you should be loved." "And how is that?" Jake thought about his answer carefully. "Gently, honestly, with respect and partnership, the way my father loved my mother, like she was his equal and his best friend, not his property." Catherine's hand found his in the darkness and squeezed. "I think I would like that kind of life." They sat like that for a long time, holding hands under the blanket, neither quite willing to break the moment. Finally, Catherine spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am falling in love with you, Jake Henderson. I know it is too soon and probably foolish, but I cannot seem to help it." Jake's heart stopped and then started again, racing. "Catherine!" "You do not have to say anything," she said quickly. "I know this is complicated, and I am still legally married, and you are risking everything to help me. I just needed you to know. Whatever happens, I needed you to know that someone has seen the man you are and fallen in love with that man." Jake turned towards her, using his free hand to gently cup her cheek. "It is not too soon, and it is not foolish. I have been trying to tell myself that what I feel is just protectiveness or duty, but I would be lying. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw you in that alley, so proud and strong even when you had every reason to give up." "Jake," she breathed, and then somehow his lips were on hers, and he was kissing her with all the pent-up emotion of the past few days. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, and for a perfect moment nothing else mattered except the two of them and the connection sparking between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jake rested his forehead against hers. We should not have done that. Probably not, Catherine agreed, but she was smiling. Do you regret it? Not even a little bit. They kissed again, softer this time, and then settled back under the blanket, Catherine's head on Jake's shoulder. Despite the cold and the danger and the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, Jake could not remember the last time he had felt so content. The fourth day dawned with clear skies and no sign of their pursuers. They crossed into California by midday, and Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. They were not safe yet, but they had passed a significant milestone. How much farther to San Francisco? Catherine asked. Another 3 days, maybe 4 if we encounter bad weather or difficult terrain, but the worst is behind us. They made good time over the next few days, and as they traveled, the connection between them deepened. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Catherine spoke of her hopes for the future, of perhaps opening a bookshop or a school for girls. Jake found himself imagining a future where he could help her achieve those dreams, where he could be part of the life she was building. On the evening of the 6th day, they crested a hill and saw San Francisco spread out before them, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, the bay beyond reflecting the last colors of sunset. There it is, Jake said, your new beginning. Catherine stared at the city with an expression of wonder mixed with trepidation. It looked so big, so full of possibilities. They rode into the city as night fell, and Jake found them rooms at a modest but respectable hotel. Separate rooms, though it pained him to be apart from her after days of constant companionship. They agreed to meet in the morning to visit the bank. Jake lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling of his hotel room, and realized that everything was about to change. Once Catherine had her money, she would be free to go anywhere, do anything. And while he desperately wanted her to have that freedom, part of him was terrified that her plans for the future might not include a cowboy with no prospects and no fortune. The next morning they dressed in the best clothes they had and made their way to the bank where Catherine's trust was held. The building was imposing, all marble and brass, and the clerks inside looked at them with barely concealed disdain at their travel-worn appearance. But when Catherine presented her credentials and explained her business, their attitude changed immediately. The bank manager himself, a portly man with impressive whiskers, came out to greet them and led Catherine to a private office. Jake waited in the lobby, watching the clock and trying not to imagine all the things that could go wrong. An hour passed, then another, and finally Catherine emerged with a leather portfolio under her arm and a dazed expression on her face. "Did it work?" Jake asked, jumping to his feet. "It worked," Catherine said. "The trust is dissolved, and the funds are mine to do with as I please. $3,247. She looked down at the portfolio like she could not quite believe it was real. "I am free, Jake. For the first time in 3 years, I am actually free." Jake wanted to sweep her into his arms right there in the middle of the bank lobby, but he settled for a smile and offered his arm. "Then let's go celebrate your freedom properly." They found a restaurant and had the finest meal either of them had eaten in recent memory. Catherine was glowing with happiness and relief, and Jake found himself memorizing every detail of her face, every expression, wanting to hold on to this moment forever. Finally, as they lingered over coffee, Catherine grew serious. "Jake, we need to talk about what happens next." His stomach clenched. "I know. You have your money now. You can go anywhere, start over wherever you choose." "I can," Catherine agreed, "but I find myself not wanting to go anywhere if it means going without you." Jake's heart stuttered. "Catherine, I do not have anything to offer you. I am a ranch hand with maybe $100 to my name and no prospects beyond the next job. You deserve so much more than that." "What I deserve is a man who treats me with respect and kindness, a man who sees me as an equal, not a possession, a man who would risk everything to help me when I had nothing to offer in return." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I deserve you, Jake Henderson, if you will have me." If I will have you? Jake laughed, though his eyes were suddenly burning. Catherine, I have been halfway in love with you since the moment I saw you in that alley, and I have been all the way in love with you since somewhere around the second day of our journey, but you are still married, at least in the eyes of the law. I spoke to a lawyer at the bank, Catherine said. He tells me that California has more progressive divorce laws than Nevada. With evidence of abandonment and abuse, I can file for divorce and have it granted without Charles's consent. It will take time, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, but it can be done. And in the meantime, Catherine smiled. In the meantime, I thought perhaps we could both stay in San Francisco. I could look for a property to start my bookshop, and you could find work at one of the ranches in the area. We could court properly the way people are meant to court, and when the divorce is final, if you still want me, we could talk about a future together. Jake came around the table and pulled her to her feet, not caring who might be watching. I will still want you. 6 months from now, a year from now, 10 years from now, I will still want you, Catherine. He kissed her there in the restaurant, and she kissed him back, and the other diners whispered and stared, but neither of them cared. The next months unfolded with a kind of joy that Jake had never experienced before. He found work at a ranch south of San Francisco, and Catherine rented a small storefront in a good neighborhood and began filling it with books. They saw each other every Sunday, Jake riding into the city to spend his one day off with Catherine, and those Sundays became the highlights of his week. Catherine hired a lawyer and filed for divorce, citing abandonment and cruelty. Charles Pemberton hired his own lawyer and fought it viciously, but the evidence was on Catherine's side, and the California judge was not impressed by the Nevada banker's attempts at intimidation. Jake and Catherine courted with all the propriety they could manage, though it was torture to part at the end of each Sunday evening. They went to church together, took walks along the waterfront, attended lectures and concerts. Catherine bloomed in her freedom, her natural intelligence and wit no longer suppressed, and Jake fell more in love with her every time they met. 8 months after they arrived in San Francisco, the divorce was finalized. Catherine came to the ranch where Jake worked and found him in the corral working with a young colt. She was wearing a new dress of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and she was smiling so brightly that Jake knew what had happened before she said a word. "It is done," she said, waving the legal papers. "I am no longer Catherine Pemberton. I am just Catherine Clark again." Jake vaulted over the fence and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed. "Marry me," he said. "Right now, today, marry me." "We have to get a license first," Catherine said, still laughing, "and I want a proper wedding with flowers and a nice dress. But yes, Jake Henderson, I will marry you today or tomorrow or whenever you want." They were married 3 weeks later in a small church in San Francisco. Jake's mother and sisters made the journey from Texas, and Mrs. Donovan came from Nevada, along with Tom Morrison and several of Jake's friends from the ranch. Catherine wore a dress of white silk and carried a bouquet of roses, and when Jake saw her walking down the aisle toward him, he had to blink back tears. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed Catherine with all the love and promise he could pour into that single moment. At the reception afterward, Tom Morrison pulled Jake aside. "Got a proposition for you, Henderson. I have been thinking about expanding my operation into California, running cattle on some land I've been looking at south of here. Need someone I trust to manage it. Interested?" "How much land are we talking about?" Jake asked, hardly daring to hope. "About 500 acres. Good grazing, water rights, room to build a decent house. I would give you a share in the profits, enough to make a real living." Tom grinned. "Figured you might want to have something solid to offer that new wife of yours." Jake looked across the room to where Catherine was talking with his mother, her face alight with happiness, and felt his throat tighten. "Yes, sir, I am very interested." They moved to the ranch 3 months later, and Catherine brought her love of books with her, setting up a small lending library in their parlor that became popular with the scattered ranching families in the area. She also started teaching reading and writing to the children of the Mexican and Chinese workers on the ranch, refusing to accept the common prejudices of the time. Jake threw himself into the work of building up the ranch, and with Tom Morrison's backing and his own hard work, they prospered. Catherine managed the ranch's accounts with the same skill she brought to everything else, and Jake came to rely on her judgment in business matters as much as he cherished her presence in his personal life. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Jake's father, was born in the spring of 1879, 2 years after they were married. Catherine had a difficult labor, and Jake spent 16 terrified hours pacing outside the bedroom door while the midwife worked. But when he finally held his son and saw Catherine smiling tiredly up at him, he knew that this was what true wealth looked like. A daughter followed 2 years later, whom they named Clara after Mrs. Donovan, and then another son, and then twin girls who kept them up at night and filled the house with laughter during the day. Life was not always easy. There were hard years when the cattle prices dropped, and they struggled to make ends meet. There were illnesses and injuries and the normal trials of raising a family on a working ranch. But through it all, Jake and Catherine faced everything together, as partners and equals. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake took Catherine on a picnic to a hilltop overlooking their land. They sat on a blanket and watched their children playing in the grass below while the sun set behind the distant mountains. "Do you ever regret it?" Jake asked, holding her hand. "Marrying a cowboy instead of someone with more to offer?" Catherine looked at him with those green eyes that still made his heart skip even after a decade together. "Jake Henderson, you gave me everything that matters. You gave me freedom and respect and love. You gave me children and a home and a life where I can be myself. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "Sometimes I think about that day in the alley," Jake said quietly, "about how close I came to just riding past, minding my own business." "But you did not ride past. You stopped, and you saw me, and you helped me when no one else would." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You saved my life that day, Jake. Not just from starvation or Charles, but from a future where I would have stayed trapped and broken. You gave me back myself." "You saved me too," Jake said. "I was just drifting before I met you, working jobs and sending money home, but never really building anything of my own. You gave me a reason to put down roots, to build something lasting." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. Below them, their children's laughter rang out clear and bright, the sound of joy and innocence and a future full of possibility. "I love you, Catherine Henderson," Jake said. "I loved you when you were begging for bread behind a shop, and I love you even more now if that is possible." "It is possible," Catherine said, smiling up at him, "because I love you more today than I did yesterday, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. That is how love works when it is real and true and built on respect and partnership." Jake kissed her then soft and sweet, and felt the rightness of it settle into his bones. This was what he had been meant for all along. This woman, this family, this life they had built together from nothing but determination and faith and love. Years continued to pass, bringing both sorrows and joys. They lost Tom Morrison to a heart attack when he was 63, and the old rancher left Jake the California property outright in his will, along with a letter expressing how proud he had been to know Jake and Catherine. They mourned him deeply, but honored his memory by continuing to build on what he had helped them start. Catherine's bookshop dream never quite faded, and when their children were older, she opened a small bookshop in the nearest town. Managing it with the help of their eldest daughter, it became a gathering place for the community, somewhere people could find not just books but conversation and connection. Jake expanded the ranch gradually, buying adjacent parcels when they became available, always careful never to overextend themselves. He became known throughout the region as a fair employer and an honest dealer, someone whose word could be trusted and whose handshake was as good as a legal contract. They heard nothing from Charles Pemberton for many years until a brief notice in a Nevada newspaper informed them that the banker had died of a stroke in 1889. Catherine read the notice without emotion and then burned the paper in the fireplace. "That part of my life is over," she told Jake. "I do not wish him ill, but I do not wish to remember him either. My life began the day you found me in that alley, and everything before that is just prologue. Their children grew and thrived. Thomas became a veterinarian and opened a practice in San Francisco. Clara married a teacher and moved to Sacramento. The other children scattered across California and beyond, building their own lives, but always returning home for holidays and celebrations. In the summer of 1907, Jake and Catherine celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and the community they had helped build. They were both in their 50s now, gray threading through their hair, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch of the home they had built, holding hands and listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. 30 years, Catherine marveled. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that we rode into San Francisco with nothing but hope and determination. Best 30 years of my life, Jake said, though I'm hoping for at least 30 more. Catherine laughed and squeezed his hand. I will do my best to stick around, cannot let you have all the fun without me. They sat in the peaceful darkness, and Jake thought about the journey that had brought them here. He thought about a desperate woman begging for bread, about a decision to stop and help when he could have ridden past, about the trust that had grown between them on a dangerous journey, about the love that had sustained them through 3 decades of life together. He thought about how much could change in a moment, how one choice could ripple out and reshape everything. If he had ridden past that alley, Catherine might have starved or been forced back to her abuser. He might have continued drifting through life, never knowing what he was missing. But he had not ridden past. He had stopped, and he had seen her, and he had helped. And from that one moment of compassion, an entire life had been built. What are you thinking about? Catherine asked softly. About how lucky I am, Jake said. About how grateful I am that I happened to ride down that particular alley on that particular day. It was not luck, Catherine said. It was you being the man you were raised to be. A man who stops when he sees someone in need. A man who does the right thing even when it is difficult or dangerous. Maybe, Jake allowed, but I still feel lucky. Lucky to have found you. Lucky to have been given the chance to love you. Lucky to have built this life with you. Catherine turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft light spilling from the windows. Even now, after 30 years and 5 children and countless trials, she was beautiful to him. Not the superficial beauty of youth, but the deeper beauty of strength and character and a life well lived. We built it together, she said firmly. Every bit of it together. That is what made it special. That is what made it last. Jake leaned over and kissed her, tender and true, and felt the love between them as solid and real as the land beneath their feet. This was what mattered. Not money or status or power, but this connection, this partnership, this love that had been tested by time and trials and had only grown stronger. The ranch continued under their stewardship for many more years. Jake taught his sons and grandsons everything he knew about horses and cattle and working the land with respect. Catherine taught her daughters and granddaughters about business and independence and never letting anyone make you feel small. They were not perfect people, and their life was not a fairy tale. They had arguments and disagreements and moments of frustration. But they always talked through their problems, always treated each other with respect, always remembered that they were partners facing the world together. In the spring of 1912, Jake developed pneumonia during a particularly harsh cold snap. He fought it for 2 weeks, with Catherine never leaving his side, but in the end, his body was simply too worn from decades of hard work. He died peacefully in their bed, holding Catherine's hand, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Catherine lived another 8 years, running the ranch with the help of their sons and continuing her work with the bookshop and the school she had helped establish for local children. She never remarried, telling anyone who asked that she had found her great love and nothing could ever replace what she and Jake had shared. She died in her sleep in the winter of 1920, and her children found her with a smile on her face and an old, faded photograph clutched in her hand. It was a picture taken on their wedding day, Catherine in her white dress and Jake in his best suit, both of them beaming with joy and hope and love. They buried her next to Jake on the hilltop overlooking the ranch under a simple stone that read, Catherine Henderson, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She was trapped, but she was freed by love. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, passing from children to grandchildren to great-grandchildren. The story of how it all began became family legend, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. The story of a cowboy who stopped in an alley, a woman who refused to stay broken, and the love that grew between them against all odds. And if you visit that hilltop today, you can still see the two simple stones side by side, marking the final resting place of Jake and Catherine Henderson. The land around them has changed. The Wild West has been tamed. But their story endures as a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple act of kindness, and the deepest love can grow from the darkest circumstances. Their legacy was not just the land they had worked or the family they had raised, but the example they had set. They had shown that love built on respect and partnership could weather any storm, that courage and compassion could overcome cruelty and control, that two people who started with nothing but each other could build something that would last for generations. The banker's wife had begged for bread behind shops, and a cowboy had fed her and discovered she was trapped. But the story did not end there. It was only the beginning of a love story that spanned decades, built a dynasty, and proved that sometimes the most beautiful things in life grow from the darkest soil. They had found each other in the worst circumstances imaginable, and from that meeting they had created a life filled with love, purpose, and meaning. That was their true inheritance, worth more than any amount of money, more lasting than any monument. It was a love story for the ages, born in an alley in Nevada and blooming across the hills of California, a testament to the power of human connection and the resilience of the human heart.